My name is Marki Thompson. I am an LCSW, so I have my master's in social work is what that means essentially. And I have been a therapist for almost 4 years now. And I went into being a therapist to work specifically with eating disorders. And then since being a therapist, I've learned that I just kind of love working with women and issues that kind of specify in that area, PCOS being one of those. I like to read a lot, actually. I read 10 books the other week. So I like to clarify that because some people don't. When I say I read a lot, people are like, oh yeah. And I'm like, no, it's a lot. It might be a problem. We don't know. I come from a big family. I really outgoing. I love to do fun things with friends. And if I'm laughing, I'm happy. So that's me.
Cool. I am Josie Iroz. I'm a registered dietitian, and let's see, I have been working with eating disorders for, well, like, I guess this job is very much working with eating disorders, working with Modern Eve, but just kind of the nature of working in nutrition and doing nutrition counseling on an outpatient basis, kind of like a clinical setting even, you kind of just see a bunch of eating disorders because that's just pretty prevalent in the community, unfortunately. So experience with that. And trying to think, I did not necessarily go into nutrition to work with eating disorders, but kind of fell into it and really felt like I enjoy it and make the biggest difference with people with that. But I mean, you know, you start working with eating disorders or disordered eating and you come up with a bunch of the other people, and that includes PCOS patients or individuals or clients, just because there is correlation with that. I think any population that is told to lose a lot of weight for treatment, you ultimately get a lot of eating disorders as well. So anyway, so it's an area that I'm really passionate about and I'm excited about today's webinar. Some other random things about me, I guess, is I really like to do jigsaw puzzles. I do a lot of those. Like I did like 3 in the last like 10 days or something. So quite a few.
Wow. Wait, okay, and I have to ask.
Yeah.
How big are they? Are they like 1,000
pieces? One was 1,000 pieces and then 2 were 500 pieces. So I do probably at least one a week. So anyways, that's fun. And I dog and I do lots of dog walking. And work. I don't know, I like to cook. Kind of a typical dietitian thing though. So
I've yet to meet a dietitian who doesn't like to cook.
Yeah, honestly. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. So as far as like, I think kind of a structure or kind of like what we're going to do today in this webinar, we're going to speak on PCOS and kind of go over like, what is PCOS? Marki has like personal experience with PCOS, so she's going to go into that. And then we're going to do some like myth busting. So talking about some of like the kind of the common things you hear, especially on social media or people just that had PCOS, and kind of like there's a lot of information out there and it is overwhelming, I think. And so kind of going over a bunch of those, like what's myth, what's not, what's real, what's not. And then kind of go over some like quick places to get started. If you do have PCOS or you're just newly diagnosed, or maybe you've been diagnosed for a long time and you're unsure of like where to get started, or it just feels like so chaotic, kind of where to step back and start anew with kind of managing symptoms, and kind of go from there. So Marki, you want to start us off on your personal experience and story?
Yeah. And I think too, like something, I want to say this too before I tell my story, and I guess this relates to my story, but Josie and I were talking about how PCOS, there's so much information out there. It's so overwhelming. And so, you know, we could easily spend 5 hours just talking about PCOS, going through like the really minute details. And so we're not going in to like super in-depth as you could be. But hopefully this will give you a good overview. And kind of what to look out for, because part of my story is that I got a lot of false information or incorrect or like half false, half true information. So I'll tell you my story. Okay, so I was 17 and I got a cyst on my ovary and we had to do an ultrasound and they basically saw scarring tissue of that, basically said I had other cysts, and that looked like I had some other cysts currently. And so when I was 17, they kind of said, hey, it looks like you've had some cysts. This might be something that you might want to consider down the road, that you might have PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. When I was almost 19, I was like officially diagnosed. I didn't have a period for 9 months, and I was not pregnant. And so I went to my doctor. We started me on the pill. And I think it's important too to know that this was back in 2008 that I was doing this, and like where we're at now versus then, such a drastic change in information just in those like 12, 13 years. Being a part of this community has drastically changed. And so my doctor, I love my doctor. He's not a PCOS specialist. He's just my general practitioner. I've had him since I was 14. But I love him because he never once told me to go on a diet. He was really supportive with how I wanted to manage. And so we started with the pill, and that really helped. It took us a couple years, honestly, to find the right pill that really worked for me. Pills would work for a little bit, and then I would get cysts that burst and it was painful, or, you know, stuff would happen with my hormones. One made me depressed, all that kind of stuff. I was lucky that the pill really did help me manage my PCOS for quite a while. And that is an option for a lot of women, is the pill. A lot of people don't like to do it. There's also a lot of myths surrounding the pill on if it actually causes PCOS, but that is not true. It doesn't cause PCOS. Some people will have been on the pill and their PCOS emerges like after, when they're trying to get pregnant, and so they're off the pill or they're off it for other reasons, and so they think it's from that, but it's not. And so I was really okay for a few years. My symptoms were not terrible. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I started to have like an increase in symptoms, like uncontrollable, like really, really rapid weight gain. Like I gained like 30 pounds in like a month without changing anything, which is obviously very unhealthy weight gain. My acne was really bad. I got depression, all this kind of stuff. And so I started doing a lot of research, more than I had been doing before. And basically what happened was I was surrounded by basically everyone saying to go on all these different diets. That one of the most important things you could do is to not eat carbs, not eat sugar, and basically nothing good, nothing yummy. And I'm like, I'm sorry, try to take away my bread. Do it. I dare you. Anyways, just all these things about like, you know, if you have PCOS, you can't have this, you can't have this, you can't have this. And it was so hard for me because I was like, on one hand, I really want to be healthy and manage this condition I have. But on the other hand, it seemed so ridiculous. Keto was one of the things that was suggested all over. And so I did keto and it was awful. I felt terrible. I felt sick. I did lose weight, but it wasn't sustainable. That lifestyle isn't sustainable. And later I learned like carbs are actually extremely important for women with PCOS. And so anyone, but especially women with PCOS, you really do need it to help with your hormones. And so to do something like that to my body, I was actually just hurting myself and making my PCOS worse, making my hormones worse. And I really struggled with body image. I struggled with my relationship with food, so many things. And so I was kind of this yo-yo dieter. I kept trying different things. And then I became a therapist, and I knew I wanted to work with girls with eating disorders. And I started working at the Center for Change, and it wasn't something that I felt like I could be dieting, even though I was like, well, if it's for my health, it's good, right? But I didn't feel like I could sit there and diet while telling my clients the dangers of diet culture and how awful it is. And so I stopped doing that. And it was actually in that space that I started to find dietitians that were trained in working with PCOS and were intuitive eating dietitians. And that is where the real help kind of came. I was at that time pre-diabetic. And so my doctor and I did have to do some different interventions there. But other than that, really what I did is I listened to these dietitians and I started to learn to listen to my body. And as I've slowly done that, I'm not cured. That PCOS, you can't cure it, unfortunately. It's hard for me to kind of, I guess, exactly say, I mean, it was 12 years, right? It's been 12 years of having this. It's so hard. It's a hard thing. And I really empathize with anyone who has it and who's struggling, because there's not enough information out there that's correct, honestly. And I started to have all these clients who had PCOS. It was just crazy how it just happened. Or I would have clients who would tell me what was going on, and I'd be like, I think you have PCOS. And so we would get them tested, and they did. And learning how to manage their PCOS along with their eating disorder was life-changing for a lot of them. And so it's something I've learned to specialize in as a therapist, but then also personally, I know what it's like to have all the feelings. When I was told at 17 that I could have PCOS, and then at 18 I was diagnosed, one of my main things I wanted to do in my life was to be a mom. And so to have someone tell you at 18, like, hey, you might not be able to do this thing you've wanted your whole life. I mean, it's really heartbreaking. And so on that spectrum, just to being a hormonal mess, okay, like, it's awful. And people don't recognize how it really is intricately tied to every single thing that you do. And so I hope that you understand that you're not alone. You have a full-blown emotionally healthy therapist crying over this right now in front of you, because it's hard. It's still hard. If someone were to ask me if I could just magic wand, get rid of it, 100%, I wouldn't want to deal with this, but I do. And I am so grateful that it enables me to help other people who have PCOS. Obviously, I could go into way more detail. We could talk all about the therapy that I had to do for my own body image issues and everything that was so ingrained within the PCOS, but I won't, because for sake of time, but I do understand. So that's my story.
Thanks, Marki. So something we kind of skipped over, but I think just like defining PCOS would be a good first kind of just make sure we're all on the same page what PCOS is. Because I think a lot of people go, like, they're defined, maybe when like kind of like Marki when she was like a teenager, and they're kind of, some people are told like, oh, this is a fertility issue. So come back when you want to have babies or when you want to get pregnant, and then we'll deal with it then. But I would hesitate to say that's a good idea, just because it is like, it's an endocrine hormone condition. And hormones affect not just fertility, but everything from like how your pancreas works and insulin and blood sugar and fatigue and all sorts of other issues. So Marki, like, I don't know, from like you told me your story, but as far as like the diagnosis, kind of go over like, do you have to have cysts? Do you have to have cysts? All that.
So you don't have to have cysts. And I don't know when the medical world discovered that. I did not find that out until probably like a year or two ago, honestly, that you didn't have cysts. I thought that was like the symptom. But it was a couple years ago from one of the dietitians I follow. She shared this research of basically saying like, no, there's actually a good amount of women who have PCOS who don't have cysts. But when it was originally discovered, or the term was coined, that was, and to be fair, they probably didn't know enough back then, right? They thought it was a fertility thing, and they thought it was just based on you have cysts and then it's causing all these other issues. And so it got named polycystic ovarian syndrome. And there's actually like a huge movement within the PCOS world and community of people who feel like it should be renamed because it's not actually accurate. One of my best friends, she has PCOS and she's never had a cyst in her life. And so PCOS has, I think, this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess most people think it presents a very specific way. You have a very specific body type if you have PCOS. You have all these XYZ. I was that person. Okay, I had this cyst. I am I'm in a larger body. That's okay, right? We're fine with that. Health at every size. We can talk about that. There's this kind of typical like what it looks like to have PCOS. And it wasn't until probably 10 years into my diagnosis that I started seeing these women who didn't look like me, didn't function like me. Like my best friend and I look completely different. We function completely different. The way food interacts with our bodies is completely different. And she's been trying for several years to get pregnant and she hasn't been able to. And so they did some diagnosing, and it turns out she had PCOS. But again, there was no indicator there in the typical symptoms, so the doctors didn't look for it. So yeah, I think it's really interesting because you don't have to have cysts, but a lot of people look at that. And so if you ever go to the doctors, I would say one of my biggest pieces of advice, and they tell you you have cysts, two things, okay? One, it does not necessarily mean you have PCOS. So if they tell you, oh, it looks like you get cysts, you could have PCOS. Big, large, painful cysts that burst is not a part of polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so if you're having that, there might be some other issues there that you want to get looked at. If they tell you you have PCOS and they don't do any testing, you ask for testing, because there are a lot of other hormone things that could be going on as well. That's not PCOS, but a lot of times when doctors see cysts, that's what they go to. So I would absolutely insist on being tested specifically for PCOS.
Yeah, and especially because the diagnosis of PCOS is considered a diagnosis of exclusion, which that means basically you're excluding anything else that could also present similar symptoms, including cysts. And so if, so it's really like, okay, if we've checked thyroid, we've checked all other hormonal things that could be causing fatigue, could be causing high blood sugars, insulin resistance, could be causing cysts, acne, body hair issues. And then if none of those, we can't find any other diagnosis, sometimes that's when we start diagnosing with PCOS. So when we say getting tested, that's kind of what that means, is like going and getting tested for several other things, because having a diagnosis is helpful, because then you can actually target treatment, or treatment, maybe not to cure, but to control and manage symptoms. So
yeah. And I was diagnosed when I was 18, and we did the testing, all that. It's blood work essentially. And then again, my doctor, and this is why I love my doctor, okay, even though he doesn't specialize in this, he, about 3 years ago, some of my symptoms were getting worse, and we were pretty sure it was my PCOS. But he said to me, let's run a full panel of tests to make sure nothing else is going on. That is a good doctor right there. Okay.
Right.
And so we did, and it was still PCOS. And so we were able to say, okay, great. We do know for sure it's nothing else. So we'll treat it like it's PCOS, because that's what it is looking like. So I think it's not just important to have this one diagnosis and like this one testing at one time and that's it, but continue to do testing throughout your treatment and your care and management of this condition, because, again, my symptoms flared really bad about 3-4 years ago. And so that's when my doctor was like, well, let's still make sure it's nothing else, because you don't want to treat PCOS and then have it be another hormone issue that could have been something else. So.
Right. Great. Okay. I think that sounds great.
Am I allowed to ask questions?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you were diagnosed, what specific blood tests did they do? Do you know?
I don't know. And probably because I was 18, so I didn't know. I didn't know to ask. I know when I was a few years ago, I know he specifically ruled out thyroid issue. He ruled out, what else did he rule out? I know we for sure checked thyroid, because thyroid issues run in my family. And so he's like, I for sure want to make sure that's not the case. And so I know that they have to check for androgens. That's one really specific one that they have to check for PCOS. And they'll check your testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, all of those normal ones. But I don't actually know the list. I bet it exists somewhere. Do you know, Josie?
I don't, but I'm pretty sure it's just when they're checking for certain, they do panels. And so usually there's a metabolic panel, and there's a diabetic panel, which is kind of your A1C and all those. And then there's a thyroid or a hormone panel, which brings in all you're testing specifically for hormones. And that's where you get your estrogen, testosterone. But then there's a metabolic one, which is different. And then you have your vitamin mineral ones as well. So there's a whole different panels. So asking for specifically for hormone related ones is what you want to ask for.
Yeah. And that's usually what I tell my clients is to say, if they think they have PCOS or hormones, to ask specifically their doctor, can we run a hormone panel test so that we can see what's going on? Most doctors are actually going to be really great about that. In my experience, if you get a doctor who's weird about it, go find a new doctor. Yeah, because that's not a ridiculous request at all. But there are doctors out there who will act like why are you acting like you know what's going on with your body, right? And so I don't know all the specific things, but it's usually just, all the hormones, they'll check everything. And so that's what I know my doctor did. And then he looked basically at any of these things that would indicate it wasn't PCOS, and there was no indications there. And so he was like, still looking like that's, what we're dealing with, which I was grateful for. I didn't want to have to deal with a new thing. So.
Right.
Can I ask a question kind of like along those lines? How do you find a doctor, right, that is in that sort of like that mentality of like working with you, or that healthy at any size, or things like that? I think that's definitely something that I'm struggling to find.
This is hard because I feel like it's a real hit and miss with my clients when we're looking for a doctor. My doctor, unfortunately, is not taking new clients because I've referred a few people and they are like, he's not taking anyone new. My doctor is a general practitioner. He does not specialize in PCOS. I saw a few specialists and I didn't like them. And he never once has told me to go on a diet. I asked him why a few years ago after I started working with eating disorders. And he told me because his best friend in med school actually had an eating disorder. And he said, and weight does not indicate health. And so I would say finding a doctor you feel like personality wise is really fits, that they listen to you, that they'll do the things that you want to do, but also give you good recommendations. And then I would ask questions like, and tell them, like I have my clients say, I don't want to be put on a diet. If that's what you're going to recommend, can you tell me now? Because I don't want to go on a diet. And usually the doctors are really great about saying, like, you can usually tell by their attitude with that question alone what kind of doctor they're going to be. And then also, I don't know, I feel like that question is honestly the biggest indicator of saying, like, how often do you recommend dieting to a client with PCOS or something like that, or hormone issues, and see what they say. Because if that's the case, then they truly don't understand what's going on with PCOS.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's kind of hard to find. Honestly, they're like pretty far and few between doctors that are also like health and exercise aligned and are like on board with all that, which is unfortunate. And hopefully that is changing. But yeah, I think, especially if you run into a doctor, or maybe you have a good relationship with the doctor, or if you do or you don't, but I think asking the question, if they do just keep recommending dieting and losing weight as your general treatment, I say flat out ask them, get a new doctor, or flat out ask them, like, what kind of like recommendations or treatment plan would you offer for your like thin or straight sized patients with PCOS? Because that's the thing about PCOS. There are thin or straight sized people that have PCOS, and there are people, in larger bodies that have PCOS, and weight gain does not cause PCOS. So therefore losing weight is not going to cure PCOS. And if your doctor is seeing you for PCOS, very likely he has other patients who are in quote unquote normal size bodies and straight size bodies that also have PCOS. And so I think just like empowering in healthcare.
Yeah, I've also had some clients find success with like more holistic doctors. These doctors typically don't take insurances though, and so they're usually pretty pricey. And I don't have any specific ones off the top of my head. I also have some clients who it's kind of hit and miss with an endocrinologist. Some find great endocrinologists because it is an endocrine condition. And others, it's the same thing. Like I have one girl who had an endocrinologist who every single time, are you doing would recommend the keto diet? And I'm like, how do you recommend that as an endocrinologist? I don't understand, but he would. And so also too, I've had some people have more success with female doctors, and on other hands, I haven't. So I do think it's one of those things where it's kind of like dating. You got to try a few sometimes before you find the right one.
Yeah. Or if you have a good relationship and rapport with like a OB or a gynecologist, they also have the power to run a blood test. Yeah. So if you feel like that is a good relationship that you could have, you could ask if that's something that they would be comfortable doing, or, they can do that. So, and especially because it is kind of in the fertility world, which is kind of in the OB gynecologist world. That's another, I've had patients that have had basically their because they have PCOS, their OB or gynecologist kind of acts as a primary care in specifically managing PCOS. So that's also a good option. So if you don't have an OB or gynecologist, or you don't have a gynecologist, that's something you could seek out if you're not having luck with a primary care.
I am going to give a personal plug that I'm currently in grad school to be a PA, and I'm
awesome.
Working towards this. I'm like one of the 3 total in my class, but like, it's fine. It's happening. So like, it's not just me as well. So like, just to give you guys some hope. It's not just,
yay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say this. I think that I'll say this really quick before we kind of move on to our next section, but again, being a part of this world for the last 12 years, night and day difference. And so I'm hoping in the next 12 years, and we're unfortunately, I think, in that transitionary period. And as we see more women in science and in the medical field, hopefully we see more research too. I honestly think part of the reason is men were like, who cares? And so the research was few and far between because it wasn't important to the people doing the research. And so hopefully the more, go Tanya, the more females that we see, is that how you pronounce your name? That we see in the field, we can see more representation and research. So
that's excellent. Okay. I think like moving on to some myth busting, I think we'll go over like the whole weight management is the #1 treatment for PCOS. That is kind of everywhere. It's the first thing you see is if you want to cure or treat your PCOS, you have to lose weight. And yeah, kind of like I mentioned earlier, PCOS is not caused by weight gain, so therefore it cannot be controlled or cured or whatever by weight loss. And so generally, I think that is like #1 treatment is, I think I would even say like a harmful recommendation, just because especially with PCOS, people with PCOS, like weight loss is actually really difficult and more difficult with PCOS than other people. And weight loss in general is already really a difficult thing to even achieve / maintain, if that's something. So I think like, as far as like, when I think of like, how does like the health at every size approach fit into PCOS? And I think it totally fits in. And I think really what is helpful with at least patients that I've seen with PCOS is to, one, I think approach it with curiosity. And especially because you as an individual have your own personal research and experience with PCOS and probably with trying to diet. Or if you live in this community and you live in this society in a larger body, you've also probably had experience with the pressure, or have experience with trying to be in a smaller body. And so I think kind of taking first your own personal data and research and going with curiosity and kind of asking yourself the question, like, has this ever been successful? Like, has this like restriction and trying to diet and trying to cut out these food groups and trying to do all this in the effort of controlling PCOS, has that ever been effective as a treatment option? And if it hasn't, then that's when I think it's like, okay, maybe a different approach is a good next step. And so I kind of always like to put weight management or weight loss as really like, instead of thinking of that as the focus and the goal, instead of look at it as a side effect. Mm-hmm. This is something that is like, we are not doing what we're changing, or the foods that we're eating, or the diet we're doing, or the lifestyle that we're choosing to do, or the exercise for the effort of weight loss. We are looking at as like, it might happen, and things might happen, and you might notice that once you start listening to your body and listening to like what kind of foods it likes and what kind of foods digest well, and you start maybe managing blood sugars if insulin resistance is something that you struggle with, that you might notice that weight loss is a side effect of that, and that's really common. But it's not, I think, looking at it as the goal is where people go wrong. And I think it can be harmful. What are your thoughts on that, Marki?
Yeah, no, I just echo everything. I think one of the things that I saw the most when I was doing a lot of my research in my mid-20s was these stories of women on blogs, like when blogs were still like a huge thing. And they would be like, I cured my PCOS, and they would tell me about how much weight they lost in this diet. And I mean, and that was such a I thought a beautiful thing. I mean, it was in my Alexa keeps going off and I don't know why. It was this thing that I was like, oh, there's a cure, there's hope. Right now, there's not, we don't know enough. And those kind of stories, as great as they sound, I would guarantee you check back with them in a year or two and it's not cured anymore. And which means it was never a cure. Right. And so it's just dangerous to get into that place. Right. I said earlier, I gained about 30 pounds in a month and a half time. That was not a healthy weight gain. Well, think about this. When people are like lose 30 pounds in a month and a half, that's never going to be a healthy weight loss either. And so it works both ways. Right. And so I can promise you that even as my body has gotten bigger at times in my life, I have still been able to maintain management of my PCOS and be healthy. And sometimes that has meant sometimes my weight has gone down and sometimes it hasn't moved at all. And so weight management is not a treatment, but it can sometimes be a side effect.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good way to look at it, is taking it off of this is my goal, and instead putting it as, this is a side effect of other goals. Like, for example, like I'm trying to, maybe you have high blood sugar and now you want to start controlling that and having like lower A1C if you do have diabetes or you're pre-diabetic, and like getting that in control. And you start doing that, and that is the focus. And you might find that there is a side effect of a weight change. So yeah. I think that's kind of how to go about that. And yeah, and then I can open it up to different kind of attitude towards it. Cool. Okay. So I think now we'll move on to the next one, which I think is kind of going over all of the food restriction stuff you hear a lot of, especially on social media, like cut out gluten, cut out lactose, cut out dairy, cut out carb, cut out sugar, all these things, which can be so frustrating because it's like all the good stuff first of all, and then just like turns into a restrictive, like what can I even eat? And then it feels impossible. And then of course, like there's like the carb cravings, which can be actually higher with people with PCOS just because of the nature of it. And it's a hormone thing, and hormones regulate a lot of things, including metabolism, like hugely metabolism. So many hormones regulate your metabolism. So I think going over lactose and dairy first, this one is like super thrown around, and it's like there's so much. And I think, okay, first off, like because this is a diagnosis of exclusion, this also means that everyone has different symptoms and different presentation of PCOS. So what that also means is that there are going to be different treatment options. And this is where it can get dangerous, because like, you know, you might have a friend or someone you follow on social media who's like, I cut out lactose or cut out dairy and it completely stopped my PCOS symptoms, or it completely changed everything. And it's like, I believe you. That probably maybe did. You probably found success there. And that does not mean that is going to help every single individual. And so, and then so it's like, it's kind of like, so that's looking at like your personal, again, the personal data thing, like actually being curious, like about what does my body system like and don't like. And it's like, okay, if you notice that like lactose, when you have lactose in your diet, that causes some problems, and maybe that's something to look at. If you're like never thought lactose is a problem, then there's probably nothing wrong with lactose in your system. Yeah. And as far as like research goes, like actual data, like scientific research, controlled studies and things, the most they found that was like consistent with like good data and good population studies and sizes was that like they found that with individuals with PCOS, they found that doing for a lot of those, there was consistency or significance with some women doing lower levels of lactose and having more control over symptoms. What that meant though, like when you actually look in the like description of what does low lactose mean, that means 2 servings of dairy a day or less. So that doesn't mean no dairy. It just means less. So they found that like, so that's what I mean by like, it can feel really restrictive when you are with someone with PCOS, but it really might mean is that you have a lower tolerance than maybe someone without PCOS. And it's just finding that tolerance level, finding that threshold. So yeah, maybe you're not someone who can have a, you know, like a large McFlurry from McDonald's, but maybe you can get away with the small snack size McFlurry McDonald's because that's within your threshold. Or maybe you're like someone that can do, maybe you can't have a glass of milk, with every single meal during the day, but maybe you can have some milk with your cereal in the morning, and that's fine. So I think it's kind of like, and also certain foods have higher and lower levels of lactose. So milk and ice cream, yogurt, those kind of things have higher levels of lactose, whereas like cheese especially has really pretty minimal, just because of the nature of what cheese is. It's a fermented food, that it has lower levels of lactose. So I think kind of finding a threshold is a good place to start. So if you feel like lactose is something that is a struggle for you and your body system, I think the approach should be cutting it. Like, you can eliminate it and then you want to add it back in and find a threshold. If you feel like you have never thought lactose is an issue, then it really might not be an issue for you in your diagnosis of PCOS. So that's kind of the spiel on lactose and dairy. Anything to add, Marki?
Not for lactose and dairy. I don't have any issues with that. Luckily, I do have a gluten sensitivity, so I will chime in when we get to that one.
Yeah. So gluten, kind of the same thing. So I think that's like when we think about any food item and we're taking a whole food group out or a large food group out, is again, looking at it as like, it's likely, unless it's a true allergy, which means your body is not reacting to the protein that is in that food. And that's like causes like anaphylaxis, shock and stuff. But if it's like an intolerance, or that's where you want to look at threshold. So for the same thing with gluten, it's, maybe like if you have gluten with every single meal, every single day, and you start noticing, that's not good for my body system, that's when you want to work on like threshold and finding something that is, maybe you can tolerate, some gluten once a day or maybe a couple times a week, but for the most part, you choose to do gluten-free items and certain foods. So Marki, what is your experience with that?
So gluten was something that I think years ago, I kind of could tell my body was reacting to, but again, as I mentioned, do not try and separate me and bread. But it got to a point where it got pretty bad. And so I was like, okay, I got some testing done, and it wasn't a complete intolerance, but it was a sensitivity. And so I kind of essentially had to figure out what my tolerance was. And then I heard actually earlier this summer, I had a friend who was also, she doesn't have PCOS, but she has Hashimoto's. And so she was going through some similar things there. And she found out that there are certain types of yeast she was reacted to and others that she didn't. And so I actually decided I pulled out all the gluten from my diet for 2 weeks. And then I added in sourdough to see if sourdough affected me, and it didn't. So I actually eat sourdough. I've learned to make sourdough. It's something that, again, when I do have gluten, when like just that's not sourdough, like if I'm having a decent amount of protein with it, that usually helps me personally. So like I can eat a burger, no problem. Thank goodness. But like pizza is a little bit harder for me. And if I do a day where I have like cinnamon rolls in the morning and pizza at night, I'm probably going to be sick. But I can eat it more sparingly. And so it's been nice because I don't have to completely cut it out. And I honestly have found that most women with PCOS, very few actually have complete intolerances or allergies to things. It's that tolerance of what can I do? And that can almost be harder, I think, honestly, because it took me a minute to kind of figure out that balance of, and I still don't always do great with it because sometimes I think my body can handle it and it doesn't. So I think it is a trial and error. And so be really patient with yourself as you work with that specific thing. But again, if you've never had a reaction to dairy, lactose, gluten, anything like that, you're probably fine.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think kind of, again, going with your own, like stepping away from like all the voices, including my voice and social media voices, and like, and thinking like, okay, this is what you should be doing with PCOS, and instead actually listening to what your body is trying to communicate with you. And if you have a stomach ache every single time you have milk with your cereal, then like there might be something there. If you don't, and you're like, really have never noticed that, then there's probably not. But you have to start kind of paying attention to what your body's saying and kind of mute all the voices around you, again, including mine and the social media and everything else. So that's kind of the first step, is listening to yourself and trusting yourself. The last one we'll talk about with like the food thing is like sugar and carbs. It's a big one. And this one's actually more related to the insulin resistance that is common with people with PCOS, it doesn't mean that every single person with PCOS has high blood sugars, insulin resistance, is pre-diabetic, all of that. But if that is something that you have, then that's one way we're looking at sugar and carbs. If you don't have insulin resistance, if you don't have high blood sugars, you're not pre-diabetic, you don't have any like insulin, blood glucose issues, and you've been tested for that, then there really isn't any reason that your body, like the sugar carb thing, or that you need to cut out sugar and carbs. Also, if you do have those things, there's also not a reason you need to be cutting out sugar and carbs. And that's when we start looking at it as kind of like a medical diet approach, which means that we are eating in a way that helps your body process sugar and use insulin effectively and help your blood sugar stay controlled. And just like with diabetic patients, and similar with PCOS patients or clients or individuals, it's you want to, instead of cutting out carbs or sugar, you want to start balancing it with a meal, but also you want to have consistency with carbs. So instead of just like avoiding sugar all day and then having sugar in the evening only, that's going to really affect blood sugar and blood glucose levels and insulin. And whereas having sugar or carb or starch, 3 times a day or kind of like consistently throughout your day is going to be a better approach. And so in that regard, they're all carbs and sugar. People with PCOS would benefit more with having more variety than less variety, which I think is kind of baffling considering what is spread around on social media about PCOS, where it feels like you have to restrict or cut out everything. And I know that Marki has a pet peeve with this one about fruit. So say your piece.
That's all. Fruit's not bad, friends.
Fruit's not bad, guys.
That was a huge thing I saw. Through my years of fruit has sugar in it. Okay, the air has sugar in it. Calm down. Fruit is fantastic. I was telling Josie last night, I was like, I have never been a huge vegetable person. And so when I was doing this research and they were like, fruit is bad, I was like, well, I might as well just not live anymore, because what am I supposed to eat? Lettuce and chicken. Okay. That's what they want me to eat. But that's the thing is, you know what? If all I ate all day was fruit, that would be an issue for anyone. Right. Just the same way eating brownies all day would be an issue for anyone. That's not a healthy, sustainable lifestyle for anyone. And so fruit's not bad. That's just mostly my point. If you like it, eat it.
Right. And I think it's just so, I had a diabetic client, didn't have PCOS, and he was really trying to he was just didn't understand blood sugars and he was out of control. And I asked him what he was eating and he was like, oh, well, I just have fruit for breakfast. I just need a lot of fruit. And I'm just like, okay, there's your issue. It's because you're only eating fruit with a meal. Let's work on adding some protein, add some variety. So adding variety, and that significantly helped him. We didn't take the fruit away, we added things. And I think that's another piece, and we'll get into that kind of more about simple things you can add, but add variety is a good first step. Adding things rather than taking away can be sometimes more helpful. Cool. I think, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's kind of it for the myth busters, right?
Yeah, because we talked about, cure PCOS. So, okay. So should we go over kind of quick places to get started?
Yeah. So we wanted to, when we were kind of talking about this outline, I was again, with my research and I felt lost for so long. And so we kind of narrowed it down to okay, if we were going to give you 4 places to start, 4 things to start doing, what's the best way to start? And so one of the first things actually is, and this is so funny, it's actually stress management. So a lot of people, they don't understand, but think about it, okay? Endocrine system, it's your hormones. And so when you're stressed, stress is a hormone and it can cause a lot of issues in your life. And so figuring out how to manage stress, whether that's on your own, getting help from a therapist, from professionals, from friends, family. And I think stress management looks different for everyone, right? I've really learned that, okay, there are times when stress management means for me taking a break from the gym and not going for a few days, or, you know, taking baths, or getting myself a treat, going shopping. And other times it means go to the gym because you know that you're depressed and you're stressed because you're not getting a physical outlet. Sometimes it means, Marki, pay your bills. You'll be less stressed if you just do it. Things like that, kind of learning to parent yourself a little bit, and be kind. And so I think stress management, there's lots of ways to go about it. But it's going to be one of the most important first steps to understanding what your body's like actual baseline is too. And that's another thing, is a lot of people, they do a lot of these things like weight management, dieting, all this stuff. And they're like, why isn't it helping? And it's like, well, look at all these other things you weren't doing well. You're still not doing well. You're not managing your stress. You're not sleeping well. You're not eating enough. You're not moving the way your body wants you to move. Like, that is a good place to start. So that's kind of my spiel on stress. I mean, we could do a whole thing just on stress management, but
yeah. So I think stress management, so just kind of like over the 4 things that we came up with, like places to get started is stress management, sleep, eating enough, and movement. So with sleep, like sleep is like connected to stress management. So like if you're not sleeping well, that's going to affect how you manage stress. And there's actually a high incidence of individuals with PCOS and sleep disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have not been if you feel like you might have a sleep disorder, and that is like you're waking up a lot in the night, you feel like you're getting up and peeing a lot in the middle of the night, those could all be signs of a sleep disorder.
Or
and getting tested,
fall asleep,
or struggling to fall asleep, staying asleep, or just fatigued all day long. So fatigue can be related to PCOS. It's hugely related to sleep disorders, because you never get into the REM cycle of sleep with a sleep disorder. And so it's like you're asleep, but you're not actually getting like the sleep that your brain needs to help you stay awake and less fatigued during the day. So it can be all related. So if you want to solve the fatigue problem with PCOS, that also might be solving a sleep problem. So they're connected in that way. So figuring out good sleep and getting in like a good sleep hygiene, consider getting a sleep test and asking your doctor for one if you feel like that is something that you struggle with. Stress management, again, like working with a therapist, if that's something that you haven't tried before, or I like what she said about, everything she said about that. Eating enough, like as a dietitian.
Chelsea, really quick, sorry, can I say something about the sleep thing? Yeah. So little tip that helps me, because my biggest thing with sleep is struggling to fall asleep. And so I have a pretty specific like nighttime routine, and that really helps like kind of signal to my brain like, oh, we're getting ready to sleep. And if I wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes it's hard for me to fall back asleep. And so if that's the case, I will actually get up, turn on all my lights, and do my nighttime routine again, which involves brushing my teeth, putting on lotion, my like lavender lotion, stretching, doing all of those things. And usually, honestly, I can then fall back asleep after doing that for about 20 minutes. And so that's a tip. And then we're going to talk in a little bit about supplements you can potentially take, but I also want to talk about this really quick in regards to sleep. If you are waking up in the middle of the night and you're having a hard time falling back asleep, you are most likely magnesium deficient. And so you probably want to look into getting magnesium supplement specifically for sleep, because there's a lot of different types of magnesium. So you can do some research. I did that for a period of time and it really helped. And then my body kind of seemed to be okay after that. So just a little tip about sleeping, because I'm a big baby if I don't get enough sleep. So
right. Yeah. And like, again, when we're talking about like, these are like the first 4 things you could try, or like, if you're like, everything's so chaotic about how I manage my PCOS right now, and I just need to start over, this is a good place to start. Sleep, figuring out sleep if that's an issue, making sure you're getting good quality sleep, stress management, eating enough. So eating enough is like, I feel like this is something that a lot of people with PCOS are not doing, because the first recommendation for PCOS is just dieting and losing weight. And so that's kind of what people tell you. And so for most of my patients, and clients are eating a really restrictive diet, not eating enough, skipping meals, eating like tiny little meals, and just not eating enough. PCOS, because it's a hormone and it's endocrine condition, that also means that it's pro-inflammation. So it's kind of like a really like hoity-toity word, if you will, inflammation. And it's like, can be kind of complex, but basically what that means is like anything else that's going to cause inflammation, including high stress levels, cortisol, that you want to minimize. So actually not eating enough and chronically dieting and chronically restricting your eating puts your body in this like pro-inflammatory state. And so that's why we see a lot of the clients, patients that I work with who just start eating enough consistent meals. That can be one of the biggest things to start solving some of those issues, which, so that's something I would recommend is eating enough. And then once you're kind of in a schedule of like eating consistent meals again and not skipping and being consistent, that's when we start adding in variety. So that's what we mean by like, okay, really figuring out like, what is the foods that are causing maybe gluten, maybe lactose, maybe that's like, I have a blood sugar thing, I need to get control of that. That's when we start working on consistent carbohydrates. And usually what, like, if you do have a high blood sugar chronically, or you have an insulin resistance, the recommendation for that is don't cut out carbohydrates. It's actually eating carbohydrates, so sugars and starches, but with proteins and fats and fibers. So that's what we mean by adding variety. So I think of this as really like we are adding, not taking away. Usually first step is we are adding something, not taking it away. Adding more meals, adding more variety, adding more consistency with meals, adding just like more volume to your meals is the first good step. In that, yeah. So I think eating enough, and then I think supplements also on this one would be kind of the next step after that. Yeah, supplements can be like, there is so much information out there and not all of it's true. And again, it's based so solely on, it's an individualized thing. And I would say like, I would not start with supplements. I would start with eating enough food first, then adding in variety, and then working in supplements after you figure that out, because it's hard to do it backwards, do it the opposite way. So Marki, I know you had some information about supplements. I would first start with a multivitamin. If you're not on a multivitamin, that would be a good place to start. And then, yeah, I think magnesium, like you said, B12, I think.
I was going to say supplements, you're going to find, if you were to Google this, you're going to find so many people who are like, you should do this and you should do this. And I've tried a bunch. I've done a lot of things, and I found, and research suggests this too, that there is kind of a handful of things where most people, not even just people with PCOS, most people need these, but then women with PCOS, people with PCOS. So multivitamin, okay, if you're not on one, get one, go to Costco, women's one a day. That's what I take. Magnesium is a good one. Most people with PCOS are magnesium deficient. And so that's like that would be a really good place to start too, after kind of adjusting your diet. And then fish oil is another one, because our body doesn't naturally make those omegas. And we also typically are not getting enough in our diet. And then I would also increase your fiber intake. The recommended daily fiber intake is like 30 grams. And when I started paying attention to it, I was getting like maybe 5. And I was like, well, shoot. Okay. And so I've increased my fiber, and that has really helped me. I would also say too, before you start like taking things out of your diet, if you're having stomach issues, work on that stress management. That anxiety can really affect stomach issues, as well as maybe look into taking a pre and or pro-diabetic. What did I just say? Diabetic?
Probiotic, yeah.
Fine. We're talking about stress management and sleep. I didn't sleep well last night, so here we are. A pre and or pro biotic. That is something I actually thought I was having some dairy issues. And my mom was like, you should just try doing this first. And I did, and I don't have any issues. So it wasn't a dairy thing. It was just some stuff going on with my gut. So that would be a place to start. So I think that's a good place to start. And then again, if these kind of things aren't really like making a huge difference, you're still really fatigued, you're really stressed, you're really struggling, that's when you really definitely probably do need to start getting professional help medically, as well as like a therapist and dietitian potentially.
Yeah. And then the last thing is movement. So this is, I think a lot of people have a really poor relationship with exercise, just kind of the nature of our society and community. And it's just, that's part of it. So movement, meaning daily movement that you enjoy. I think there's kind of this, like, I know Marki mentioned to me outside of this, that she was like, it's frustrating because like so annoying when you hear that there's like, you need to do this exercise. This is the best type of exercise for PCOS. And
it's a big lie.
It's a big lie. There is what's best for your PCOS is movement that you enjoy. So it's something that you can be consistent with, even if it's not the most vigorous exercise or the best weight loss exercise. I think that's where people get lost here. They're like, well, I need to be doing exercise that's going to help me lose weight. Again, we're focusing on the goal being weight loss, not the goal trying to figure out what's going on with my body and my system. And that's when we want to add in like gentle movement is kind of what it's called in the intuitive eating world, but or joyful movement. And that's finding movement that brings you joy. So sometimes I'll tell people to like do like the Marie Kondo effect with exercise. And like,
I love that. That's hysterical.
If like, if you're like going to the gym and you hate it, it's like, tell it, thank you for being part of my life and goodbye. I don't need you in my life right now. And maybe finding other things that spark joy to you. Like, like walking, like if you like walking and it's something that you really enjoy, but you maybe don't do it very consistently because it's like, I need to be going to the gym and running, or I need to be doing weightlifting, or I need to be doing all these things, but you don't like those things. Like it's better to do what you like and be consistent with, because that's what's actually the most important thing about movement is just being something that you enjoy and consistent is not adding stress to your life.
And it doesn't have to be this like huge, like you're going to the gym, you're doing these things.
Yeah.
Like if a joyful movement for you is our bodies, part of our body's purpose, I believe, is to move, right? Like otherwise, why would we have feet and arms? Like we have these things that are meant for us to use. And so like horseback riding, rock climbing, ice skating, like whatever it is for you, find that. Walking, because you're traveling in Disneyland. That's my joyful movement. Walking in Disneyland. So, like finding those things that for you, it doesn't have to be this traditional exercise. And I think when you see online, when they say, well, these are the types of exercise you need to do for PCOS. No, what they're telling you is here are going to be the exercises that help you lose the weight. And we all know that, guess what? Weight management is not a treatment for PCOS. So that's what they're really saying. And that's not actually treating your PCOS.
Yeah.
And then Tanya asked a question really quick about research on PCOS and eating disorders. I want to say, Josie, and I don't know if you know this, I want to say it's like 35, like women with PCOS have a 35% higher chance, right, of having eating disorders.
Right.
Mostly because dieting, I have one client, her doctor at 14 said, well, you're going to have to be really careful not to be obese. And so that's literally why she has an eating disorder. So there's so much of that. And so, there is research. There's not as much as I would like to see, but there is some, mostly in just what's the correlation? What's the word I'm looking for?
Association.
Yeah. So that's usually kind of what it looks like. It's similar with diabetes too. It's similar with diabetes. 1 in 4 dieters get an eating disorder, things like that. So they're very similar.
So I think it's like, go ahead.
Thought was just that, like, with eating disorders, obviously it brings about like an inflammatory state. So I'd be like curious to see if it like would be a causal relationship with PCOS or diabetes or any sort of
I know, like, this is kind of, it seems a little counterintuitive, but I know that there is like somewhat of an incidence of like restrictive type eating disorders. So this is like anorexia is kind of the biggest one of those, and diagnosis of PCOS, because they'll like lose their menstrual cycle or they'll lose their period. And so then their doctor just like misdiagnoses this PCOS, and then they'll like, then they'll like recover from the eating disorder and they'll be like, my PCOS went away, it was cured. And it's like, you probably didn't have actually PCOS to begin with, but so it's kind of
I've also seen the opposite realm, too, where people will be diagnosed with PCOS. I mean, it's what was online where I found a lot, right? And then they get really restrictive to the point where their body's not nourished. So all their symptoms go away and they're like, well, you're cured. And I'm like, no, actually you have an eating disorder. That's not a cure. Your body's not functioning normally, right? So I would love to see more research on that. That would be something I would love to see, because that is curious. I've never thought of it in that context, Tanya, of like the inflammation specifically. I thought of it in the context of, I went through a huge growth spurt when I was 14, and that's what started my body image issues, was because I went from like I jumped like 5 pant sizes because I grew so fast. And that can be a symptom of PCOS when you go through puberty, is you have this huge growth spurt. And it made me feel like I was fat, because all of a sudden I had grown so much that I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so much bigger than what my body was 3 months ago. And it started this whole thing in my mind. Whereas if someone had said, hey, guess what? Growth spurts are normal and your pant size is normal, like that probably would have helped a ton. And so, there's a lot of correlation. For sure.
Totally. I think anything like 1 in 4 dieters get an eating disorder, like, and then you put in a population of PCOS where everyone with PCOS, if they've been to a doctor, is told to diet, it's like the incidence is just going to skyrocket from there. So within the population of PCOS, I would imagine it's higher just based on the community correlation. So, but yeah, so to kind of wrap up, I think kind of just like in review, quick places to get started, like sleep, stress, eating enough, and movement. I always like to say that like the 3 silent killers of PCOS, or the 3 silent things that are causing or not helping with PCOS, is like stress, sleep, and body, like negative body image, because that kind of goes into like I need to be dieting, and then keep you in that cycle of just trying to lose weight instead of actually listening to your body and your whole body system. So as far as like when should I get a professional involved, I think if you're like, okay, I really need to work on the body image thing so I can get it out of my head that I need to be losing weight, that's a great place to start working with a therapist and a dietitian too, because usually there's some disordered eating patterns with that as well. But yeah, like if you're trying to get pregnant, fertility doctors, that's a huge one. To get a professional involved, finding a primary care if you don't have one, that's a great place to get like labs drawn. And yeah, therapists too for like stress management is also a great place to start. A doctor for like a sleep disorder test if that's something you're interested in doing. So yeah, I think if you have PCOS, you definitely should be like, there should be kind of a team approach, I think, for sure. Yeah. So, okay. Any last words, Marki?
Trial by error. Be patient, because there's a lot of things. I mean, I can't tell you, we could go into that for a whole hour, all the things that my doctor and I had tried and have tried. And honestly, like probably 50% of them worked and 50% didn't. And so don't be discouraged just because one thing works and one thing doesn't. There's a lot of layers to PCOS. And so it's complex, and it's complex. And so don't be afraid to look for help where you need it, but also don't be afraid to really listen to your body. That's something we stop learning how to do at a pretty young age. But if you think of toddlers, if you think of little kids, they're really good at listening to their body. My 3-year-old nephew every day listens to his body and tells his mom, I want cake. So, I mean, but we learn somewhere, right, that's wrong to want cake every day. And therefore a lot of our communication with our body in other ways gets messed up too. So learning to listen to your body and treating your body as a partner is something that I think is really, really vital. It's your friend, it's your partner. It's not an enemy. Right. It's not. And because of my PCOS and some other things, I spent most of my life feeling like my body was my enemy, and being able to switch that mindset was probably one of the most helpful things, that my body is my partner.
Yeah. Excellent last words.